Hello, one and all, and welcome to the fifth session of the Audio Festival Banguoja Conference. My name is Adomas Zubė, and I will introduce the speaker. This session is called Artful Approaches to Sound Design, and so we will hear from a great artist and sound designer, Ariana Martinez, how to find some new ways to bring your audio stories to life through sound design. Ariana says that too often we prioritize the meaning found in spoken dialogue instead of the intuitive, gut level, poetic meaning to be found in sound itself. And so we will hear how to find and open this hidden meaning of sound. Now, now a short introduction about our speaker. Ariana Martinez is a multimedia artist, radio documentary maker, and sound designer. They have created radio feature stories for BBC, Force, Shortcuts, and BBC Three's The Essay. They were the sound designer and engineer for Brain on Nature, which was named one of the best podcasts of 2019 by the Financial Times. Ariana's audio and visual work has appeared at Hearsay Festival, Lucia Festival, Open City Documentary Festival, and the Barbican Cultural Center's Soundhouse. So Ariana, we are really glad to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you.
And while Ariana is opening the slides, I just want to remind everybody that you can send in your questions through the Q&A section down below. And at the end of the session, I'll try to voice them all. Ariana, now I think if you're ready, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ariana Martinez, and I am a multimedia artist based in the US. So my background is actually in the fine arts. I studied sculpture, and also I have a background in kind of architectural history, urban studies, built environment. So understanding how spaces work at a kind of cultural, historical level is also part of my kind of academic background and feeds into my, my work now as an artist. I work primarily as a sound designer, collaborating on long form narrative work. That's kind of how I pay the bills, but I also do kind of short form experimental projects on my own or with collaborators. Often those projects do cross that kind of audiovisual border, lots of multimedia work in the mix. So what you're going to see is quite visual, but I think it's all related to how we can make more exciting work as audio makers. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this word that I think we hear a lot when we're describing how a good piece of audio makes us feel. Oftentimes you'll hear people say, wow, that really resonated with me. And I've just been thinking about this word a lot because we hear it so much and we seem to put a lot of stake in it. It seems to be like a high praise that we would give to an audio piece when it seems to affect us that way. And so this word resonance in a technical sense apparently has two meanings. The one, the quality of sound being deep, full, and reverberating. So something that has like a really full, almost like physical body to it. And then two, the reinforcement or prolongation of sound by reflection from a surface or by the synchronous vibration of neighboring objects, meaning that sound is moving through, against, back and forth among everything it's touching. But my favorite definition of resonance, and the one that I've returned to as I've tried to deepen my practice as an artist, actually comes from the rhetoric scholar Remy Yergo, who says resonance is an interbodily knowing, a betweenity that pervades. And Yergo uses this term specifically in reference to moments of recognition between historically marginalized and excluded people, specifically queer and disabled people. The moment when you see someone who is like you, or you feel a kinship with someone and you haven't even talked to them, and you feel their presence kind of reflecting back at you. You see a part of yourself in them and vice versa. And I think that this power, this to generate feelings of knowing and kinship between people is one of the most powerful things that audio can do. And it's something that I think audio does uniquely because of the way sound touches us as a physical medium. So the fact that resonance has taken on these other meanings should matter to us as audio makers, especially those of us who've been marginalized by dominant narrative forms and need to communicate outside of them. So I do think that the way we use sound can be an extremely powerful political and cultural tool, even when we're making mainstream work that's going to play on our local public radio station, or work that we're doing for clients, in the commercial sphere. I think that the way we use sound drastically changes the messaging and meaning and purpose of the work that we make. With sound, we can reach listeners at gut level in the places that escape language in ways that defy categorization or intellectual reasoning. We can privilege subtle, secret, and protected ways of knowing. Basically, we can use sound to insert the things that maybe we aren't allowed to say in spoken dialogue. Or maybe that would be hard to say or scary to say in spoken dialogue, but we can still insert that meaning into the work that we make. So the questions that I have for you all are how we can use sound to subvert expectations for relatability. So, and recognition, like, do we need to know exactly what we're hearing all the time? Or can we just feel it in our bodies and be okay with that? How can we use sound as an invitation to a different kind of experience rather than a directive, rather than me telling you as the audio maker, this is exactly what I want you to understand? How can I actually say, I'm opening the door for you to generate some your own meaning in response to this thing that I've made? And how do we create generous, non-prescriptive sonic worlds? How do we put as much power back into the listener to interpret and relate to and make meaning from what they're hearing? And as we go on this journey of building our own creative practice, we should know that everything we are intrinsically, so anything to do with our identity and background, and as impacted by external forces, our environment, our political and cultural context, anything that's affecting us at the moment, shapes how we will listen to, interpret, and use sound. So we're not neutral. As sound designers, we're not, just there to put the decoration and make things sound nice. We are active participants in how the work gets made and the meaning it generates. So all that theory aside, I want to give you some practical ways that I look at the world that help me, gather inspiration and information to use when I'm creating work in sound. So everything that we experience with our senses, everything in our tangible material reality, has the potential for sonic translation or transformation. Every sight, texture, temperature shift, movement, weight, internal bodily sensation can be called upon for inspiration and information. So as you're moving through your daily world, the closer attention you pay to the way things taste, the way things smell, the shift in air temperature from one time of day to the next, the way the light comes in through your window in the morning versus the evening, all of those things, if you kind of lock them in your memory and keep them, you can draw upon them as kind of references when you're trying to create similar conditions in sound. I do think that sound is a really flexible medium and can take on the qualities of things we might experience as sight, smell, touch, etc. One of the ways that I like to think about working just generally as an artist, but in sound in particular, is striving for what I call realness versus accuracy. So if you have studied fine arts, you're often required to learn figure drawing, which is you stand in a room for 8 hours and draw a model over and over and over again. And one of the mistakes that new students often make is trying to render every detail perfectly, every anatomical detail, every proportion, trying to get everything exactly right. And what happens is, because your eye and your hand are not trained to do that yet, you kind of freeze up, you get stuck in trying to render the perfect thing, and you're actually not seeing or feeling anything that you're making anymore. You're not responding to the figure, you're responding to the imperfections you see your hand making on the page. And I think what happens as you start to grow as an artist is actually you begin to trust your senses more and rely on your hand less. So you trust that, you know, what you're seeing in front of you will translate and get interpreted by your hand, but you don't have to worry that your hand is not making a completely accurate mark. And you end up with drawings like this, which are blind contour drawings, where you have this sense of vitality and energy and movement, even though this is like not an accurate anatomical form. And in sound, I think what that means for me is that when I'm creating worlds in sound, unless it's like journalistically necessary for me to have perfect accuracy, which that might be, if you're telling a factual story, you want to make sure the tape is from the exact location and the time to appropriately represent that circumstance. But in a lot of other circumstances, even documentary work, there is a lot of pulling things in from multiple realities in order to build something that feels real, even if it isn't the exact observation you witnessed out in the world. So how can we embrace the limits of our perception? We can realize that we are not machines. We cannot perfectly replicate everything that we've observed in the world. How can we pursue a sense of vitality and realness rather than perfect accuracy? How can we get comfortable with the fact that there is a difference between what we are able to produce and what we've observed? How can we actually tap into that difference and see it for its artistic potential? So I feel like sound design serves two purposes generally in audio work. One is building worlds, so creating distinct and detailed scenes, asking your listener to sit someplace like a real location, whether that's an outdoor space, an indoor space, an internal mental world, and supplying substitutes for other sensory information. So because this is an audio medium, we have to find ways to evoke things that we might experience as visuals or as touch or as sense. The other purpose of sound design is to navigate the terrain of the story. So to guide the listener's emotions and attention, to hold them through each of the twists and turns that a story might make. And to sustain that engagement, to keep them with us as we maybe take them to unfamiliar or uncertain places. So I think if we start to understand sound both at this broad kind of level, what is it doing in the purpose of the story, but also at a kind of really molecular, like material level, like what is sound and, you know, what are its material qualities? Like anything else, like clay, like paper, like paint, sound has material qualities that make it distinct as a medium. And the better we get at understanding those things, the more power we have to manipulate them, to change them, and to insert our own artistic voice with them. So we should work to understand the discrete elements a story is made of. Each kind of tape, interview, ambient sound, music, and archival tape all have different qualities, and how you respond to each one and build relationships with them will shape your work's sound. So the way that you treat interview tape, you're cutting it very precisely, you know, you're watching out for those, you know, breaths to make sure they're not cut off, you're trying to maintain the person's, you know, intended meaning, is very different than the way you might treat a piece of ambient sound that you might, you know, pitch down an octave, loop, reverse, stretch out. You might manipulate that a lot more to get it to do what you want it to do. Archival tape, things that you find out in the world, you know, they kind of act as like sculptural found objects in your piece. You know, they're carrying meaning from wherever you found them from. You know, whether that's a historical recording of a political speech or a field recording from a part of the world that you've never visited, they're carrying information from where they came from. And now that information lives in your work. No matter how much manipulation and changes you make to that tape, it came from somewhere else and it's bringing that character with it. Another lesson from the fine arts that I find particularly useful in sound design is the idea of limited palettes. So meaning that it's very easy to get bogged down and to insert way too much into a session. And you'll see, I'm going to pull up a session in a few minutes. You'll see that it is a huge session. There's tons of clips. There's a lot of stuff going on. And when you're first starting out, especially, that could be super overwhelming. So something that helped me was to think of sound design as a process like painting, where it's actually beneficial to use a limited palette. In painting, when you learn to paint, you start with, maybe 3 or 6 primary colors. So either one set of red, yellow, and blue, or 2 sets of red, yellow, and blue, one that's a warmer tone and one that's a cooler tone. But even that's getting a little advanced, like to start simple, your 3 primary colors, and learn to mix everything else in between. I think sound works the same way. So like what would happen creatively for you if you had to make a piece of audio work with 3 pieces of tape only? You had 1 interview, you had 1 piece of ambient tape, and you had 1 piece of music. What would happen? Or what would happen if you allowed yourself interview tape and 3 pieces of music, or 3 pieces of ambient tape? What would happen if you had only the voice? How much could you do with just interview tape? There's so much you could, that like the voice is an instrument in and of itself. How might you change it, manipulate it, alter it to work like other elements of sound design would? Strip everything down to the bare bones, basic minimum, and see what you can do. And that is an incredible way to hone your skill set. So when you are working with big, complex sessions with lots of tape, you can actually compartmentalize and not get so overwhelmed. The other thing that I think that oftentimes, especially if we're working professionally or if we're trained in news environments, there's kind of aggressive incentive to cut out all negative space in audio. So people's breaths are too long, we're told. You can't have too much room tone, too much silence. If you wait longer than 2 seconds between, words in a sentence, people are going to get lost or get bored. And I understand why we might cut tape like that in a, 4-minute news feature. But there's, I think, actually greater reason to pause and just slow down, especially when we're making documentary work or experimental work. Silence isn't empty. It's breath, it's stutter, it's pause, it's a lump in someone's throat as they're tearing up. It's the rustle of someone's clothes as they shift in their seat. It's their voice cracking as they describe something emotional. It's the delay in someone's thought process. It's the barely audible echo of the space they're in. It's static. It's all of these other artifacts of the environment that this conversation or that this event is happening in. It's all of the qualities of that person's speech that make them human. Like, I don't like cutting out people's stutters and breaths and things that make their speech unique. Like, everyone has speech patterns that are unique to them. And I mean, within reason, like, I like to keep a lot of that because it shows me how this person is thinking, how this person is responding to me, the interviewer or the producer. That's not a neutral relationship that's happening in an empty void box of a studio. Oftentimes it's happening, at least in a lot of the work I make, in real space and time. The other thing that comes from the world of sculpture for me is this idea of site specificity. So site-specific installation work is when you, as the artist, bring your objects or materials or processes out into the world, and you're responding to something that's already there. And I think that we actually are always doing this in audio, especially if we are using field recording or if we are recording within people's homes or lived in spaces. We're responding as much to our interview collaborators as we are to the space that we're in. We're responding as much to the specific animal sound we're trying to capture on a day out in the field as we are to the trees and the wind and the water. All of that is informing the work we're making. And if we're conscious of that, we can actually harness those things as active players in the overall artwork that we are creating, rather than thinking, oh, I'm going to have to isolate out this one bird call that I actually want from the environment, or this person's voice from the environment of their home. Like, what if we treated that entire space as the thing we're trying to capture and respond to? Some practices that, again, come from the world of fine arts, and the kind of treating your work as an audio maker as an ongoing, active, creative practice, something that you do every day, or that you do continuously without kind of necessarily looking for an end finished product. So what you're seeing on this screen, on the left, are 2 sketches from notebooks that I made in, I think, 2017. These were just journal entries. I was just spilling my feelings, not thinking I was going to make work from this at all. What you see on the right are 2 finished images from audio projects that had visual components. One was Night Rider, produced in 2018 for BBC4 Shortcuts, and the other was a long-term grant-funded creative project, No Hay Palabras, which was produced between 2018 and 2019 over the course of a year. These long-term finished projects that have since been played all over the world and broadcast farther than I could think, came from these little sketches, these thoughts that I had in the middle of the night, and I encourage you all to have a space, whether that's a digital space, a physical space, even just a mental space, a conversational space between a collaborator or a friend who you feel you're really inspired by, to have this space of play, because this is the thing that I mine from. This is the thing that I look to when I need to make new work. I have an archive ready. I don't have to make something from nothing. The other practice I would encourage you all is to make multiple versions of things that you make. So what you're seeing on the screen is a cut paper collage in my sketchbook that I then turned into a carved linoleum block for printmaking, which then was printed as a physical print, and then was digitally transformed and colored and made into a digital print. So it's all the same image, but it's been processed 4 different ways. And I think audio can work the same way. So if you make an audio story, say you've made a really polished, clean cut, news feature for a public radio purpose, you could recut that entire thing, sound design it completely differently, and it would be a narrative experimental documentary feature. You could cut it again and it becomes a poem. You could cut it again and pair it with subtitles and some visuals, and now it's a video. All of your work kind of lives endlessly in these reincarnations, and there's so much untapped potential in work we think we've already finished and already made. The other essential thing that I think is valuable across artistic practices is collaboration, and finding close and trusted collaborators who you can kind of return to as your practice grows. So what you're seeing on this screen is my friend Casey Orozco-Poor, who is not an artist. They're a physician. They are also a poet, but they have collaborated with me on sculptural work, on photographs, and on radio work. We made a piece together for Shortcuts, where I had written a poem from some found archival correspondence, and Casey acted as the second voice, basically a voice actor in this now short fictional radio play that we made together. But we've known each other now for going on close to a decade, and that trusted collaboration means that they know my intention in my work, my spirit, my voice, and they show up ready to give me real honest feedback and to tell me these are the ways that your work can be pushed further, and these are the ways that I have skills and experiences that you don't, that can make your work better. So I really encourage you all to find that if that's possible. I know it's hard, especially with COVID and everything, with us being unable to meet in person. But it's been extremely important to the development of my work. Okay, so that's all the theory. That's all the stuff. And I know we haven't heard any sound, so I'm going to try and do that for you now. So the concept I'm going to introduce now, I'm going to share a session, is using your digital audio workstation as your artist's studio. I think this is so challenging, even for me, to really feel like the DAW is a creative space, because it's technical, it has all these requirements, there's all these rules, like if you don't save something correctly, you've lost everything. You know, it doesn't feel flexible, it doesn't feel intuitive the same way like working in my sketchbook or making a little collage would. And that I find that so frustrating. But I want to try and give you some tools for, you know, treating your DAW with as much flexibility as possible and not feeling so intimidated by it. So I use Reaper. For client work, they might require me to use something else like Pro Tools, but I prefer Reaper specifically for its flexibility and its power. Like for an artist, I feel like Reaper is the best thing to use because you can kind of throw any kind of file in it and it will take it. It won't come back with an error message and say, oh, this isn't the right thing, blah, blah, blah. It's very easy to organize and color code your sessions. I treat my sessions very visually, like I just divide them into like color-coded visual spaces using regions and using color-coded tracks. This helps me see it kind of in a panoramic landscape view and navigate it and walk through it. I often will organize things by space. So what you're seeing at the top is like where things are happening, whether that's an imagined memory space or that's a physical geographic location. It's labeled and color coded at the top. And what you're seeing at the left are all of my tracks, which I'm going to open up the session, and it's a wild session. There's like a million tracks, but you know, those are all also color coded, usually by like audio type, so interview tape, ambient sound, music, and found sound. And that helps me know that, okay, all these types of tape are being treated differently, and I can see that very clearly. I use markers, these little, you know, you'll see on the screen, there's a red numbered flag. I use those often to actually convey like emotional information. So, oh, there's an emotional shift in tone in this dialogue. This might be a place where I might want to use some sound. Or I'll make very detailed notes about what specific kind of sound I'm going to use at this point. If I've gathered archival tape or field recording, I might write down what I'm actually going to use there. So that works as kind of like, if you're working in your sketchbook, right, you might write little notes about the color or the light that you've observed when you're drawing out in the field. That way you can replicate it later when you get back to the studio. Same thing when I'm listening through rough cuts of stuff or pulling selects and tape. The other thing that I really like about Reaper is the way that their media browser works. So you can play tape at the same time as you're playing stuff that's already in your session. So say you've built your session, you know, you have your interview tape in, you have some ambient tape in, but you're not sure what music you're going to use yet. In Reaper, it's very, very easy to, you know, trial every one of these tracks that I have here at the bottom in gray. I can trial them against what's already here in the session in black, without having to insert it and change things around and move things around and possibly mess up what I've already done. And this works again as a kind of sketching function, right? Like it's like having, you know, a piece of transparent film to draw over, you know, or tracing paper. It's a way to, you know, see so many different versions of what you might possibly make without committing to it. So I am going to show you, I'm going to play some tape from a collaborative project. I'm using this one because this piece is specifically about sensation and how we interpret and experience the kind of information from our senses coming into us from the world, which I think is relevant to today's conversation. So I'm going to just share my Reaper session. And this, I'll show you this first, and then I'll share my session. So this comes from a piece called The Feeling With, which was done for a public radio station in New Jersey here in the US. So it was a very informal programming space. It was an hour where me and my collaborator had to fill with anything that we wanted. So this is quite a long piece. I'll play a short section for you all. And it's just kind of a research-based, like weirdly informational, like educational program, but also very emotional and very sentimental about what it's like to have a body and move through the world and have information coming to your senses. All of the sound design and music was created by us. So everything you're hearing was either created from scratch, from our own like Foley and field recordings, or through manipulating archival tape. So I'm going to play a short section for you all, and I'll show it to you in the session so you can see what's going on. Okay. Okay, so as you can see, this is quite a large session here. And I'm going to go to this space, this, let's see. Okay. All right. Okay, so what you're going to hear is the tail end of one section, which describes like the ending of a thunderstorm, and it will lead into the beginning of a new section, which is a kind of reenactment of a long distance phone call. And I'll just leave it at that, but that's the context. And it should go for about I don't want to play all of it, but it should play for about 4 or 5 minutes, if that's okay. And I'm going to try and zoom in so you all can see. This is the space of this particular section. You'll see, the narration tape is up here. The music was built by little individual tiny segments of, there's a whistle in there, there's a mandolin, there's my collaborator blowing air into a glass jar. All of these tiny little sections built that composition from scratch. There is field recording from my home, my previous apartment, the rain outside my window. There is, let's see what else is in here. There's a field recording from my collaborators, bedroom window. There's a train that passes by. There's birds outside. There's all these little tiny things that you'll hear build up this world, this reenactment, this recreation of the mental and emotional space between us as we're having a phone call, but we're bringing in elements from our physical world. All right, so watch out for those, listen for those things, and I'll try to have you follow along in the session. Okay.
As it is to like physically feel kind of unwell as the weather changes, there's just something really kind of incredible about being in such like intimate dialogue with the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm hearing a little bit of interference. Are you all hearing that? Okay, I'm gonna play this, now that you've seen the session, I'm gonna play this from my internet browser, so hopefully, but you've seen the session, so you know what to look out for, but I think this might play better from the internet browser. All right. Is that better? Okay. Actually, I think I'm going to try one more thing. I think I can show both windows at once. Hold on. Let's see. Nope. Nope. Okay. All right. We're just going to do the internet browser. Sorry. All right. We're good.
I'm okay. It's been a really hard week. I was in a city in the Midwest, and you were in a city on the East Coast, and we'd been talking for a really long time. It was like a pretty intense call. Like we were both carrying a lot in our heads and needed to talk about it with each other. We don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but I'm curious if you feel like you know how to live alongside those things, or if they are things that you sort of can't.
Right now, I feel very lucky that I can.
It's complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really hard.
It's hard. Yeah. And probably after like an hour or more, we came to this point in the conversation where it just didn't feel like we needed to keep saying words. Like it was just okay to sit there, and that felt like the right thing to do. All of a sudden, I remember being able to hear everything else that was going on in the range of your phone's mic. And I remember the background sound of the rain on your window actually becoming louder. And I could hear you breathing. And I also knew that you were listening to what was happening in where I was.
I could hear everything in your space.
I was hearing
and you could hear everything
listen
in mine.
And I was hearing you listen to me, listening to you, listening to me, listening.
So everything that you were sensing, you know, the birds out your window, the traffic, you know, some residue of the summer air, all of that was coming through.
And all of a sudden this like weird, very safe space opened up across thousands of miles.
As soon as that space was created, it exists on its own now.
you know,
Okay, so that was that. How are we doing on time? Are we doing okay? Okay, so I'll just dive back into the session for a little bit, just so you can see what happened there. So I think that what I really like about that piece is that it's very clear that we're kind of we're responding to something real, right? This phone conversation that happened that felt really emotional and really like loaded, right? It felt like it was a space that took on its own kind of character, even though it was, you know, happening across thousands of miles in, you know, over airspace, right? So how do you make that feel tangible and real? And, you know, at the end, you heard that long expanse where my collaborator and I are not talking at all. We're just presenting to you an approximation of what that space felt like, that warmth and that that kind of staticky interchange between, you know, an East Coast window and a Midwestern window. The kind of unique conditions that each of us were occupying at the time, the physical space that was informing our mental and emotional space. So I think that was like a really interesting challenge, and I think is a good kind of blueprint for how we might treat other kind of complex situations like that, where say we've observed something in the world that we can't perfectly replicate, or we can't we weren't there for all experiences or all parties' experiences of that situation, right? Like I can only be in one place at once as a field recordist, you know, or as a producer. But there are other perspectives and other dimensions of that experience and of that story that you can then in post-production merge and build into a simultaneous experience. So I don't know how useful it would be to go into kind of technicalities here. But what you should know is that I'm not, like as a sound designer, I'm not using any special plugins other than a few like noise reduction things. I'm using mostly everything that's built in to Reaper. So I'm not like somebody who's overly reliant on the kind of like, I'm having the best tools all the time to make things happen. I think that everything that you heard was recorded, you know, at home with like basic Zoom, like handheld microphones, not even shotgun microphones, no external cables, you know, nothing like that, or literally on a cell phone. And it was all manipulated in Reaper. Let me see if I can pull these effects chains up. Yeah, there's basically nothing on them. There's some EQ on the dialogue. I'm trying to pull up the music because that's where things got complicated. Here, okay. But even that, even the long kind of hollow metallic sounds that you heard throughout that, all it is, there's some, let's see, this is the sound of a metal pot lid rotating on a countertop. That was the original recording. And the only things that are on it are some EQ. It's been pitched down a bit. There's been some reverb added to the mix, another round of EQ so the first was to get out some, probably a specific frequency that was like not wanted, and the other was to generally take out some mid frequencies so that you have the kind of high and low extremes remaining. And then some delay to draw the sound out further. You know, so it looks like, you know, maybe that looks like a lot. I don't know what people are used to using, but these are all built in. There's nothing that I've brought in, like I haven't bought any external plugins, I haven't brought in any fancy things from the outside. This is all just tools that exist in the DAW already. My collaborator did the music on this, so this is all their little technical manipulations. But I just want to show you that it's these things like, oh, how do I, change the EQ settings, or what do I know to manipulate? A lot of this is trial and error, at least for me. I mean, I didn't have engineering training. I don't know what a lot of these things, these terms even mean, to be quite honest. What I do know is what things sound like as I'm moving them around in real time. And I have honed like my ear to recognize what I'm looking for. Or I can kind of think in sound at this point, like I can hear it before I hear it. And that's just practice, like any other artistic or creative practice. That's just honing your internal instrument. The DAW is a tool. Like once you learn how to use it, you just keep practicing, you keep learning new things about it. Just like, in painting, there's always more to learn about how oil paints and mediums work. I could spend a million hours poring over, manuals about, the difference between linseed oil and stand oil and, how to mix pigment. The same thing with the DAW. I can pour over the manual, I can watch videos, I can, take workshops and learn how to use this tool. But what I think is really more important is learning your own sensibility, knowing what you're listening for. What do you want to produce? What do you want to hear? And if you don't know that going in, how are you going to then, use this trial and error process to navigate this tool? So I think even before I know there's a lot of imposter syndrome about, oh, I'm not good at the technical side of this, therefore I can't make the things I want to make. And I just don't think that's true. I think that you can always get help on the technical side, but it's really hard without like dedication and practice to have an artistic voice. And I think that's the thing that many of us don't even get the opportunity to develop because we're busy working professionally and trying to make a living doing this. And we have, requirements from our employers or our clients and whatever that dictate what we're going to make. And it can be really hard to find the time to develop your voice. But I think that all those like soft skills we talked about before we got here into the session, I really think are the most valuable thing. This tool or whatever tool you use, that just takes trial and error and using it regularly to navigate it. But I don't want people to feel scared by how chaotic this session looks, or how detailed a DAW manual might be. You don't need to know every inside out detail of your tool in order to get it to work for you. So I'm going to return to the slideshow. There's a couple things that I think we have time for. So I'm going to share again. Okay. So as I mentioned before, I have made a lot of my work through collaboration, and that's been really important to my process. And I want to talk a little bit about what that's like as a visual artist, as someone who crosses this border between audio and visual work and is often working on projects that contain both. And in case that's something that might be of interest to you all, and how you all might work with a visual artist to accompany or enhance an audio project you're working on. So my question is, if we have audio and we have visuals, does that mean we're automatically making video work? And I think the answer is no. So I often will have I will often have visuals that accompany an audio piece that I've made. So if you go onto my website, you'll see that each of my little audio features has an illustration next to it. Or there are entire audio projects where, as you're listening, you're meant to follow along almost like comic book style with a bunch of smaller images. Or there's animated GIFs on the page that are, providing a little bit of motion and stimulation as you're listening. And I found this to be an incredibly rich space for collaboration because there's a lot of hunger and need for this type of thing, especially as more and more audio work gets published, you know, across social media platforms. Like, people are really excited about visual work in response to audio. So if you have visual skills or you have friends who have visual skills in the audio world, like, they're incredibly valuable. I would say at this point in my career, like, it's almost a 50-50 split between audio and visual work that I do for clients, specifically in the audio space. Like, my visual clients are audio clients, and that's been very interesting. So this was a collaboration with Sarah Quevedo for the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Sarah was the podcaster in residence, I believe in 2019. He asked me and another artist to create kind of thumbnail images for each of the podcast episodes. So the other artist, Mercurio, did the portraits, and I did all the background color and motion. So this process was me listening to the audio documentaries that Sarah had made, taking really detailed notes about story structure and feel and mood, and translating that into visuals for each of the podcast episodes, as well as a fully animated full-length podcast trailer. This other work was, this is for a public radio kind of public health story, actually a very factual news story about water quality issues in Ohio. The reporter, Benny Becker, was producing this news feature. He had done extensive reporting for about 6 months. He had all of these amazing on-site photos, which he gave to me and said, can you create an animated video trailer for the radio story? When we publish it online, we want to have some visuals. So there's still images, still illustrations, there's animated GIFs, and there's a full-length podcast trailer as well. And this process was using Benny Becker's reporting photographs as the basis for my illustration work. And again, responding to the audio, responding to the interviews. So those are just two examples of ways that, if you're able to think fluidly between and among different types of artistic practice, whether that's visual or something else, you become incredibly valuable to collaborators. And I would just encourage you, even if you don't think you have a skill that translates to audio, you probably do. If there's something else creative that you do, whether that's writing or drawing or playing music, all of those things are really, really valuable, especially in sound-rich documentary type work. The last thing I want to talk about is transcripts, because I think this is something that really gets lost across the board, and especially when it comes to sound-rich work, because what happens often when you hear a really sound-rich experimental sound work, there's this kind of assumption that there's no possible way you could verbally translate what you're hearing in sound to a written document. It just, if it's not spoken dialogue, it doesn't need to be written down. And that's just simply not true. And it's actually one, incredibly important for just accessibility, to make sure that you describe as clearly as possible what is going on in every dimension of the story, not just dialogue, but also sound. But also, it's an incredibly exciting, creative process to figure out how to translate sound back into words. So prioritizing accessibility allows multiple realities to coexist, because every person coming to an artwork is going to experience it differently, both physically, just based on what their physical ability is, but also mentally, emotionally, culturally. So things like transcripts, subtitles, illustrations, captions, alt text for those illustrations and images, audio description if it's a video, or and then plain language summaries, which break things down into more simple, accessible language, translation across languages, collaboration with people who have different needs than you do for access, making sure that you include them in this process of creating the transcript or whatever other assistive document you have, and facilitating that process, offering this as a service that you do, in all the work that you make. So This was a transcript created for the Soundhouse Intimacy and Distance exhibition. Eleanor McDowell, who you might have heard from earlier in this festival, facilitated that project and transcribed all of that work, painstakingly transcribed all of that work. And this piece that you're seeing on the left is a completely, like a piece that has no dialogue at all. There is no human voice in it at all. It's all sound. So what you're seeing are just, you know, bracketed descriptions of the sound minute by minute. So air hisses into the scene like a train pushing through a tunnel. The feeling of an industrial space. It's filled with something. It could be air or it could be a high-pitched buzz of machinery. A low vibration pulses like watching a light bulb filament as waves of electricity force it to bloom brighter and brighter. And so as you read this document, what you'll see is that we tried to use not just visual descriptions of things, because again, not everyone accessing this piece might use vision as their primary sense. Like other people might, you know, interpret the world in a more tactile way, or using some other sense. So the descriptions include tactile information, you know, smell and taste information. We pull in as many different like kind of sensory interpretations as possible, because that gives us the like richest, fullest picture of what it feels like to experience this work. Another, again, Eleanor McDowell, in her spare time, which I don't know how she has that, creates Radio Atlas, which is a collection of subtitled audio documentary work from all over the world. So, you know, regardless of what language it's in, it is then subtitled in English. And it's really simple. You know, it's just black text on a white background. But the timing and the pacing of how she subtitles is very much in accordance with the emotional and tonal information that exists in the audio work. So if someone takes a long breath or a long pause, that next word might fade up more slowly into the screen. You know, things like that, again, provide full, rich information as to how it feels to experience this piece. Another interesting subtitled work is this multi-part story called Bob by a Dutch language audio collective. And they had published this with English subtitles on YouTube. And what they did was they have these subtle visual backgrounds. So it's not, I wouldn't classify this as a video artwork because it doesn't match up, right, with like each scene doesn't have its own visuals, but each kind of broad transition across the multi-part story does have a visual transition. And even just that, like there's maybe 5 transitions in total, even those 5 different image environments give us some information as to what the tone and feeling of the next piece of the story is going to be. And I think that's like a really good halfway point between making a full video, which is like a totally different artistic endeavor, and making an audio piece with accompanying visuals. And that's the distinction that I want to make clear, is that I think there's a huge middle ground between, okay, now we're making a full length video work and we are still making audio work, but we have used visuals as a guide or an aid to better the understanding of this audio work. And then this project, this is called Flip the Transcript, created by the Constellations Audio project for the Audio Craft Festival in Australia. And what they did was they kind of had a workshop where the objective was to collaboratively build a transcript. So you would come into the space and as you're listening, you would write down your own interpretations of what you're hearing. And multiple people did this over the course of a day. So what the transcript looks like now, this is, you know, almost a year old at this point, but what the transcript looks like now is a super rich and varied document. Like there are interpretations of things that are completely different from one another. And what this shows is that, again, everyone coming to your work is going to hear it differently. And, you know, maybe there are opportunities to show that and to really play with that and acknowledge that that's happening, that there isn't one singular meaning. So yeah, that's it. That's what I have. I'm happy to answer questions or to dive back into a session, whatever's useful.
Thank you so much, Ariana. Such a wonderful session. We have just a minute for some questions, and we've got one from Vaida. She writes, Thanks for this wonderful session. I wonder, how does someone not trained as an audio engineer overcome anxiety of doing their own imperfect sound design?
Yeah, it's definitely a process that I still navigate daily. So my advice would be to make as much like short form work for yourself as possible. So I think when I run into anxiety the most is when I'm actually working on like longer form projects for clients, because I feel like it has to be perfect. But when I'm working for myself, especially on shorter pieces, one, takes the pressure off because it's just for me, and two, because it's short, it actually allows me to see my decisions very clearly in a single frame, right? Like the huge session that I showed you, that's an hour-long radio program. It's actually very hard to see all of the individual decisions I've made and to improve upon my work because there's so much to look at and so much to try and understand. But when you make a short form work, I would say between 1 and 5 minutes maximum to start out with, you can really see all the places that you've tried to do something and where it did or didn't work. And if you share your session with someone else, say someone who's more experienced than you, they're able to see clearly what you've done and point out ways that you could make technical adjustments. But I will also say that it matters a lot to me, like what kind of tape I'm working with. Like if I'm working with tape that I think emotionally is precious, I'm very hesitant to manipulate it or to experiment with it. So when you're learning, I would encourage you to just, use free libraries like freesound.org to download tape that you do not have an emotional connection to. You don't feel like someone's going to be disappointed if they hear this and it's not like, what the precious interview I took with my grandmother, and if she hears it and she doesn't sound the way she wants to sound, she's going to be mad at me. Like, take all of that out of the equation and just work with tape that has no personal stake in it for a little while. And that will help you just practice your tools. Like, again, I mean, in fine arts, we have sketchbooks for a reason, right? There's spaces where we can make decisions without consequences, and we don't have to show them to anyone, and we don't have to worry about what goes in there. I would encourage you to have a session open all the time in your DAW that is a sketchbook session that you just throw things into and play with. And you never have to publish any of it. You never have to share it with anyone unless you're asking for feedback.
Okay, and I have one question.
Yes.
Do you think about the environments where the listener might listen to your work? How does that impact your work? Because I was walking down the street today listening to one of your works, and there was this huge construction site that almost complemented the sound of your piece. And I've got that idea that, oh my God, radio is such an augmenting reality media. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
Totally. I love this question because it's actually something that I talk about with collaborators all the time. There's an amazing audio artist, James T. Green, who's written extensively about literally like what he has called augmented audio realities. So that experience of listening to something, listening to something in a space changes the way that you hear it. And not only does it change the way that you hear it, you also are now changing the space in your kind of mental, like in your memory now. That space is different because you've mapped something else onto it. So say you walk through your neighborhood park every day silently, and now suddenly you put on a radio program and you're walking through your park again. That space now has the embedded information of all of your previous experiences, and now this new information from what you're hearing. And now that space is transformed. I think that's such a rich territory for experimentation, and a way that, like, if we think deliberately about this, like, we can actually design works to be heard in specific spaces, just like we might do for site-specific sculpture. Like, it's very much And I think that power is actually greatest in the realm of like public radio, stuff that's really broadly distributed, right? Stuff that people are going to hear in their cars, people that are going to hear, you know, in their homes, or, you know, walking their dogs. Like that kind of stuff, the stuff that gets really broad exposure, is where I personally would be most excited to play with very deliberate placement and intention about like, oh, I know that this might be listened to in a car. How might I respond to that? You know, like what about motion, or about enclosure, or about speed can I tap into and acknowledge in the work that I'm making? So I think that's like so exciting.
Somebody missed the name of the guy who wrote about audio augmented reality. Could you?
Yes, his name is James T. Green, and just incredible audio artist, and really truly one of like my closest like inspirations and collaborators. Like I can't recommend enough.
Okay, we gotta check him out. I don't know, we're just really out of time, so we gotta wrap it up. Thank you so much for a great session, Ariana, and I hope to see you somewhere when the COVID is over. You can find the program of our Banguoja Festival at banguoja.lt, and also please consider joining the last session, which is called Creative Talks, Telling Challenging Stories. It is today from 6 o'clock Vilnius time. And with this note, I want to thank you all for attending this session today, and see you soon.
Thank you all.